Han Solo. I'm captain of the Millennium Falcon. Chewie here tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system.
Yes, indeed. If it's a fast ship.
Fast ship? You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
Should I have?
It's a ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. I've outrun Imperial starships. Not the local bulk cruisers, mind you. I'm talking about the big Carillion ships now. She's fast enough for you, old man. What's the cargo?
Only passengers. Myself, the boy, 2 droids, and no questions asked.
What is it, some kind of local trouble?
Let's just say we'd like to avoid any Imperial entanglements.
Well, that's the real trick, isn't it? And it's going to cost you something extra. 10,000, all in advance.
10,000? We can almost buy our own ship for that.
But who's going to fly it, kid? You?
You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself. We don't have to sit here and listen.
We can pay you 2,000 now, plus 15 when we reach Alderaan.
17, huh? Okay, you guys got yourselves a ship. We'll leave as soon as you're ready. Docking Bay 94.
94.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and today I'm continuing with part 2 of our Millennium Falcon special. Joining me today, I have James once again, and we are going to pick it up where we left off last time. Getting back to the different compartments of the ship, you have cargo holds in the Falcon, and let's go over these cargo holds. The main hold is the biggest area, which is where the lounge area is, where Luke is practicing his lightsaber and Han Solo is sitting on that whole scene. That's the main cargo hold.
Exactly. They modified it for their own, I guess, to pass some time if they were flying, but that was where the stuff they're hauling would be parked.
Now, if you picture the Falcon pointing upwards, let's say you're looking at a piece of paper and the mandibles are facing up, to the top right, or at the 11 o'clock position from that main cargo hold, you have what's called the forward hold. There's a smaller hold area. Then to the right of that, at the 2 o'clock position, there's a cargo hold number 2. And these 2 cargo holds are basically linked in the center by the area where they can then load, whatever cargo they have. You load it through the front mandibles into this little room, and then from that little room, you decide, send them to the right, to the hold number 2, or send them to the left, to the forward hold.
Or into the secret compartments, which were probably...
Well, these are all connected. That's the thing. And we never get to see these rooms, unfortunately. They don't make it into the movie, but at least they are in the blueprints. There's also a third cargo hold, which it's when you walk up the ramp to the left of the corridor, next to the engine room, there's a third cargo hold. So there's really 4 different cargo areas. That's why the ship theoretically can hold 100 cubic meters of cargo, because it has a lot of cargo rooms. The engine room is in the complete rear of the ship, connected to the number 3 cargo hold, and back there is where you have the 5 single escape pods that we never see but we hear about. And you also apparently have a freight elevator there that you can use to load
from the ground,
to load some stuff into the engine room, even cargo. If you wanted to load some more cargo in that manner, it could be done that way. The crew quarters for the Falcon is basically 3 bunk beds. In theory, you can accommodate 6 people.
Of course, Chewie is 7 foot tall, so the bunk beds don't look like they could fit him.
I don't know what Chewie does. On the floor. He must scrunch up somewhere, I guess. And one of those bunk beds, one of the lower beds, is apparently a med bed, a medical bed, which is the one we see Luke using.
You see Luke in.
Like we mentioned before, the Falcon has 2 side airlocks and locking rings. There are no escape pods on the Falcon's sides. They're used as docking rings.
I'd like to mention, though, in Empire, you see more of the ship.
Yes.
And that's good. We like that. But you see it basically when Han and Chewie are basically trying to fix the hyperdrive and stuff like that. And they've got open hatches and the tools are falling on Han's head and stuff like that. That's just a reverse angle, basically, from where Luke and Obi-Wan and the chessboard and everything like that. That's looking forward, I think.
Right, they don't have to build everything. They don't have to.
So it's all the same area that we had originally seen, just looking at it from a different angle, opening the bottom a little bit, so he could be fixing things, and Chewie's down there, and the R2's falling into the hold and stuff like that. But it's still all the same area.
It is. Now, as we mentioned before, the boarding ramp is airlockable. If you remember when Han Solo runs into the Falcon after he's being shot at, as soon as he steps up the ramp into the main corridor,
it's actually coming up as he's walking it.
The door closes on him.
Yeah.
Because that's a way of locking that door so it becomes an airlock. You also have other ways to get in and out. There's an upper hatch that we see at the end of Empire where Luke, Lando grabs Luke and brings him down. Well, in the blueprints, you could see there's a little tiny elevator platform that raises up from inside the ship that takes you to that hatch.
And that's like a little hump. There's like a little hump on both sides. And so there's like a double airlock. And you kind of see it with Lando, and he clips his carabiner onto it when he's going up there. So one door opens, and then the outer hatch opens.
But here's the trick. If he's in an area that has an atmosphere, like in Cloud City, he can just be propelled up with that little elevator, just a little platform, brings him up into the hatch. But if he were to be outside in space and needed a spacesuit, for example, it shows you on the book that a cylindrical tube also descends as he ascends, creating a small airlock area there. But obviously for Empire, there was no airlock needed because he's in an atmosphere. Next to that, there's apparently also on the floor of the Falcon a bottom hatch. And this bottom hatch obviously doesn't have an elevator. It has a little ladder that takes you down the ship if you ever were to enter the ship from below. It also has an airlockable feature because if you close that door, the little space between underneath where the ladder exists is where you would perform the airlock, basically. The freight loading room, that's the room that I was talking about earlier, where everything comes in through the front of the ship. It gives you access then to the forward hold and the number 2 hold. And the freight loading arms or the tractor beam is what actually grabs the material that you're bringing into the ship. I wish we could have seen that in one of the movies. That would have been great. You mentioned the secret compartments. Apparently they're sensor proof, so nobody can track you in there like they try to in Star Wars. And apparently they can also vent those compartments into space, which I'm thinking maybe that's what Solo did
when he said he had to dump his
cargo with Jabba. That's he's pissed off about. Maybe that's where he was hiding it. I don't know.
But he actually mentions that it's funny. It's Carillion. You assume Carillion, they're known for their certain style of ships or something. It's like in Norfolk, Virginia, they make a lot of military ships. In certain areas, they might make some pleasure boats, things like that. So he does say, the big Carillion bulk cruisers as if the Empire has their own version of Carillion ships in addition to the Star Destroyers and the Super Star Destroyers and things like that.
You also mentioned earlier where Han Solo was working to fix the ships. The ship has a series of maintenance access hatches, which is also where R2-D2 falls into, where Han Solo, the thing falls on his head, and Chewbacca's in there working there too. The ship also has a lot of work bays and computer stations, which we see R2-D2, C-3PO, even Han Solo working on them.
And Han is actually sitting in front of a version of that. In the first movie, R2's actually talking to it in the second movie. What I'd like to know, though, is, just for kicks, where approximately in the ship is Han kissing Leia when C-3PO shows up and annoys him?
You can see that in the manual. In this manual, they show you that little compartment that is just basically a work, like computer and engineering, and it's a little closet type of area, and that's where it happens. Well, the other area that you get to see a lot on New Hope, you don't see much of it in Empire, and in Jedi, it was cut out of the film, is the gun turrets.
Yeah.
The gun turrets, apparently, again, if you look at the history of what you're told, is that the ship usually comes with a top dual cannon. But Solo adapted it to a quad cannon.
Which are more powerful.
Right.
Obviously.
And then added a set of bottom cannons, too. So if those things don't have the cannon, those are supposed to be like little lookouts, little windows that you can go and see what's happening underneath the ship or on top of the ship if you don't happen to have the guns on it.
And let me tell you, just so from my point of view as a kid, James, that was the coolest thing ever.
Oh, it was great.
And I didn't quite get it at the time. But, as you get older, you start to realize relationship and stuff like that. One's climbing up to the top of the ship, the other's climbing down. Now, they kind of give you that impression, but you don't realize, because then when Luke is at the...
It looks like they're shooting off the sides.
Luke is at the bottom, right?
Correct.
And Han is at the top.
Correct.
And exactly. Then they're really, one's laying on his front and one's laying on his back. And the impression is then, well, they're actually sitting, I guess, on our normal, what we would call our x-axis. But I think that's what it is. But then in reality, though, I guess at that point of the ship, gravity it's not supposed to play as much of an effect. Now,
well,
the reality is he's probably either going 6 to 10 feet towards the top or 6 to 10 feet towards the bottom. But because now, while we see the way they shoot it, it looks like they're sitting like you would be sitting in a lazy boy or something like that.
Yeah, and they're being pushed
in
backwards.
Reality, one's facing down, and the gun then has a 180 type of move, and the same thing on the top. Now, I didn't get it at first, and then I built the model because the toy is a little vague. The guy, he's laying, so the toy is actually more realistic than we think it is. But then when I built the model, I'm looking and I'm seeing how everybody would be sitting. And it might even been like a miniature little figure to stick in there that you could paint in to look like Luke or somebody. And I'm saying to myself, wow, this now changes the whole dynamic because while they're shooting, the reality is instead of sitting like on a lazy boy and just spinning around and the gun fires, the reality is he's on his back. Right. Or Luke would be on his stomach, which means gravity doesn't quite play as much of a role at that point.
The thing you got to keep in mind is that even though nobody really gets into it deeply, I mean, Star Trek films, I think they delve into a little more of the science of what you're dealing with. In the Falcon or in any ship, there is some kind of gravity taking place. Obviously, these guys are not floating around like space shuttle, astronauts.
No.
There is gravity. They're walking around the thing upright. The ship is like leveled like this. If the ship tilts one way, everybody tilts that way. Okay, fine. It's weird. But in the book, it says that the turrets have an additional gravitational Johnson rod, if you will, that allows the people who sit on those chairs to feel the gravity as if they're sitting on a chair, no matter which direction they're facing. It kind of keeps them in place without them having to be, buckled into place. And
we just have to suspend a little disbelief or whatever, and you realize it's for the art and for the excitement.
Right. The book also tells us that those turrets are remote controlled, and at a certain point earlier on, they could be controlled by foot pedals from the cockpit, but they're saying that Han Solo found it cumbersome, and Chewbacca couldn't fit his feet into that because his legs are so long.
And you mentioned that the Jedi cut scenes had real actors who told their moms they were in Return of the Jedi, that they were sitting in those shots to shoot scenes, which got cut, sadly.
They got cut. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm sure
but we have the action figures now, too.
We have an action figure of one of them. I feel sorry for the other guy. And there were two guys, an older guy and a younger guy. The younger guy is a typical Luke Skywalker type actor, young, handsome. The other guy is a little more rugged and older. They made a figure of the older guy, and this poor young guy who he's probably in his 60s now for all we know.
Yeah.
Never got an action figure, or I don't even think he even got a credit.
What was the one that they made the figure? What was his name?
Kraken. They called him Commander Kraken or something like that.
General Kraken.
It's like, who knows?
Colonel Kraken.
Who knows? But like I said before, you are supposed to be able to control these. And according to the book, he still does have remote control. It's on the console, no longer on the feet. The other gun the ship has, the ship also has torpedoes up front.
Yes.
A number of them. Not a lot.
Funny you mentioned that. Where do the torpedoes come from? Because in Jedi, it appears they come from the place where the hatch is supposed to be.
And they're supposed to be on top of in between the mandibles.
Where it is. The launchers are on the toys. They're actually on the some of the models, but it just appears that it's coming from the front. But
it's not from the opening doors that are supposed to let the freight in.
They're like kind of on the mandibles.
It's from right underneath that area. They're supposed to be hidden down there. But the other guns that apparently the ship has is the one we see on Empire for the first time.
That comes from underneath the cockpit.
Right. It's a retractable gun that it's around the cockpit boarding
area. That's probably
area.
another modification or something.
And they say that those are special guns, just like the bottom turret gun. They're special because they're specifically programmed not to shoot at the landing gear, because you don't want your own guns shooting your landing gear away or your boarding ramp. So they're specially made for that. But that retractable gun, apparently it's like a security device. Is that people try to sneak into your ship, it'll shoot at them or something.
Just a little quick thing, which might be a little off topic, but when they built the props, they built the exterior props, they built only half of it for Docking Bay 94 and the Death Star.
Yes.
They built a whole version from an actual shipping company, a shipbuilding company for Empire, which they kind of scuttled eventually. They saved it, and then they eventually got rid of it, and they only used a portion of it again for Jedi in the sandstorm scene that got cut up. But to support this piece of wood that they built, they had like a fuel area in Docking Bay 94. Then they added another piece of landing gear later on in the full-size model. In the sandstorm, we really didn't see it, so we
don't see anything.
We don't know. To actually support it, they had to have some support because 2 landing gear wasn't quite enough. So we see, I think, in Bespin, we see like 5 landing gear or 6 landing gear. There's actually like 7 apparently.
Well, here's how it works. From what I've seen here is this. In the front of the ship, you have 3 single legs.
Yes.
But in the rear of the ship, you have 2 double legs. So in theory, it is 7, but it's really 3 singles and 2 doubles. Like 2 thick ones and 3 thinner ones.
And none of the toys, the Legos, they're all kind of vague. The models are
you can't.
Yeah, the models are even kind of vague, which always annoyed me. So for my Lego, like, I'm actually, as sad as this is to admit, I'm looking at a Lego version sitting on top of my TV right now. And I added the little version of it because I had these other pieces to make it so it was more, lifelike or whatever.
Did you write them an angry letter? How dare you?
Dear Lego, how dare you not properly support the Millennium Falcon? No, I
owe me
my own.
You owe me 2 legs.
It had always bothered me when the toy only had 3, and one of them was supposed to be like a handle that you could fly the toy with, and the other one slid up inside, and one folded up. And the model was a little closer, but I think they only had like the equivalent of 4 doubles. And whenever I made a Lego version, that's really the only way you could make it more lifelike.
Well, the only other internal things that are interesting, in the Falcon also is the fact that they have a holo game, which is very prominent in Star Wars. You get to see them playing the holo chess or whatever the heck that's called. And according to the book, that table is also like an all-purpose table for anything they have to do indoors. So if they're having lunch, they're probably eating on top of that table.
Sure.
In theory, When Luke is hunched over and Leia's consoling him, he's kind of over that table, I believe.
I'd like to thank you personally for buying me the pieces. So whenever
those are
whenever
cool.
I make my own version of that round chess table, I will have the pieces ready to go, even though they're not holographic.
No. Well, talk about figures that were never made. They could have made figures out of those creatures.
And it seems like one of them eventually became the Rancor.
Yeah, you could see traces of them in there. His
neck is a little different, but he has that bit of that kind of gait.
Yeah. The other thing they showed you in the Falcon is the combat remotes that Luke is playing with his lightsaber.
Now, is that Falcon-centric, or is that like Obi-Wan-centric?
No, it's Falcon-centric. According to the book, Han Solo uses those for target practice.
With his blaster.
He shoots at them, they shoot at him. Obviously, he's not shooting real lasers at it, but that's one way of practicing with it. The other thing you also see on the ship, there's a helmet, like an X-Wing helmet.
With the blast shield.
Yeah, so you figure, what is that for? They don't tell you that in the book. I can only imagine maybe for the turret gunners. Maybe sometimes they need a helmet.
I venture a guess that like bombers in World War II who were launching the, nuclear bombs, they had kind of a darker shield over there. They weren't, like regular bombers might have had just goggles. Maybe this was just in case, they were actually launching something that was a little bit more high intensity.
Right. Well, the other option could also be, you're talking about the actual blast shield feature of the helmet.
Yeah, because, eventually there's going to be a blowback.
Right. But having a helmet there at all in a ship that big, the only thing I could think of is, in this book, they talk about spacesuits. There's actually spacesuits in the ship hidden away in case somebody has to go out in space and do a repair.
And in the comics, they actually did that.
Well, maybe that helmet is part of that spacesuit.
After we do a show like this, now I want to know more about how much of the comic guys, the comic writers knew, which is probably they knew nothing, because knowing what I know about the comic industry, they were very inventive and they made up their own reasons for stuff. But on the other hand, if they had any discussion with anybody from Lucasfilm or Lucas himself, he might have said, because George would throw out these little tidbits, it would be, blah, blah, blah.
Well, this brings us to another, if we talk about spacesuits, and again, these are spacesuits, they look a lot like an X-Wing type of spacesuit. They don't look like typical astronaut spacesuits. And the helmet kind of looks very similar, except, of course, in the neck, there's a sealable area where you can actually create an internal airlock within your suit.
Yeah.
Which this could lead us to a future show that I think we might have talked about in the past, and that is, do X-Wings have escape pods, or do the pilots eject? Remember, Porkins, eject.
Where are you going to eject
What's
to?
he
To the
ejecting?
Death Star?
Is he ejecting a portion of his ship, or is he going into space in his suit? Which, again, this is a teaser for a future episode.
Well, I don't want to tie it into, there's always a link of Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica, but there was an episode of the new Battlestar Galactica that Apollo ejected, and he's floating in space.
He's floating, he's got some time. Maybe that's what we're led to believe.
He's got time to get saved.
Right. Now, the final thing I'm going to go over very quickly is another space-related thing that sometimes they have to deal with in the Falcon, and they did in Empire, is Minox.
Yeah.
Minox, apparently, they attach to the ship, and they're not only in caves or inside big slugs, they appear apparently in other places, and they attach to the ship. Not only do they chew, but they apparently suck like the energy. They actually can suck the radiation and energy from your ship, and they actually have to go out there and shoot them down.
Good for Godzilla, bad for Millennium Falcon.
Exactly. But they even mention Minox, for crying out loud. So,
oh dear, shoo, ghastly beast.
I know we talked about this in the past, but I mean, at one point we wanted to do a show about just ships in general, but just the Falcon alone, there's so much information, it's ridiculous. You mentioned before that when they build these things, not only do they built them in chunks, sometimes they build them whole, but what do you remember about, whatever happened to these things when they're built?
Well, the saddest thing I've heard, and I reading it more recently in the Rinsler books.
Yes, the pictures, yeah.
It broke my heart that they built a real British shipbuilding company, built it in pieces, they sent it to the set. On the set, they basically built the set around this life-size equivalent of the Falcon. They then broke it down and they built the Bespin set around it and things like that. They didn't need to use the whole thing for Jedi, but it was still around. It was still in storage. And then it appears it was scuttled. It wasn't sent to Lucasfilm. It wasn't sent to California. It wasn't saved somewhere in Elstree or someplace in a warehouse. It was basically busted up when they knew for sure they weren't going to need it, and thrown out the back door of the studio.
In Jedi, it's funny you mentioned Jedi, because, if I remember right, when you take aside the deleted scenes of the sandstorm, where they actually did use a chunk of it, but we never got to see it.
Yeah.
The time that you see the Falcon at its biggest,
it's really just a painting.
At its biggest in a landing bay, it's a matte painting, like you said, and it's a shame because it kind of did look a little matte painting-y.
And to me, it's so sad that was built.
Right.
Money was put in. It was very expensive at the time.
But you also have to keep in mind, like we mentioned also earlier, the fact that if they would have saved it, yes, it would have been great. However, it's the type of thing where you can only look at it because you can't really walk into it.
No, but it would have been nice if they could have put it somewhere.
Of course.
Or stored it until they could put it somewhere.
Of course. That would have been great.
Disney.
Oh.
There it is. There, it's like they've got that facade of the AT-AT. It would be so fantastic if a place like that.
Or they have remember the Boneyard where they have those, was it Disney? Or I think it is Disney, where they have like these, they're supposed to be ships and props from other movies.
They have it at Disney, and they have something similar in Universal.
Yeah, just sitting there rotting away.
I remember when I was in Universal, I would say it was probably the early 90s. They had some cars and they had some things, the Bluesmobile or something. I'd be making this up, I don't know. But they had things basically just rotting there. Yeah. And I mean, it just seems like such a sad thing, and they eventually scuttled it, supposedly. Now, they're possibly going to rebuild a version in the future Disney Star Wars hybrid park, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The land. And they're supposedly rumored to be building a Falcon for episode 7. Now,
that would be nice.
It seems easier now that they can do it than having to have shipbuilders in England do it. But just the fact that they had it and, it was gone. It's just too bad.
I know.
It's just the way life works. Well, and especially life in movies work. These are props. These are sets. We build them. We break them down. Nobody apparently saved the sets of the Enterprise from Star Trek. The show ended. A couple of years went by. It's not coming back. Goodbye.
Well, at least we'll have the toys, right?
And the toys are what's so cool, because that's what's basically propelled this show and other people to do these cross sections.
Well, the first Falcon was the Kenner Falcon.
Yeah, and I got it, as many kids did, and it had the equivalent of what we were supposed to see. It was just the relationship to things were off,
Right.
and, the cockpit was basically just a hatch.
Right, the
opening
ratio
up.
is always off.
But then they made the model, and then they made, eventually cross-section models, and they made, little books and posters, and then they made Legos.
The die-cast.
And then they made a giant $600 Lego, which was supposed to be a little bit more close, to scale. It was at least supposed to be scale, assuming that Luke and Han were in the, 5'10" to 6 foot range, that the Falcon that they built was to scale to those minifigures. Yes. Then they built a smaller version of the Falcon for Legos, which I had, which was actually pretty cool in terms of the relationship of the ship, but it didn't open up or anything. They made die-cast versions. Mm-hmm. They made...
Well, the newest one is the BMF you mentioned earlier.
The BMF was as close as the scale for the action figures.
Yeah, it was pretty good scale. And then they repackaged it with the vintage packaging.
Yeah, I did not get the vintage packaging. I have the original packaging that they put out in 2007. They tried various different toys. I have a mini Lego version that came it was probably around $4 to $6. That was essentially just like a mini version, And, the models that the guys used, the original one I think was around the 6 foot ballpark. I remember at one point for Empire, they used one that was the size of a quarter to go across the front of a modified Star Destroyer.
Oh, tons and tons.
And then that's just the various stuff over the years that they've made in terms of toys and models. As crazy as it sounds, since we're going to talk about all the versions of the Falcon, I think Lucky Charms or something back in 1977 or 78, you had a paper version that it came in the box. You folded it up a little bit. It had two little things that popped up on the top that you connect to a string or a thread or something. So you could put it one high and one low, and the Falcon would fly down. They did that with the TIE Fighter and the X-Wing and the Land Speeder as well. And it just these goofy little things. I know that the Japanese have made a bunch of them. There's been some type that you can fly with it had a little propeller inside, so it almost became like a hover Falcon.
Right. Plus the high-end collecting market that has the really large ones. Some of them even light up in the back. You could see the engines. You could see
those
the
are really expensive.
You're talking about thousands of dollars here.
The one really, 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 and I can't put as many really...
It's the size of a table.
Cool things. Kenner put out approximately, I would say, in the 80s, but it was probably more the 90s when they came back. They gave Toys R Us's a larger version, like a 4-foot version that they would hang in the toy aisle.
Yeah.
And then they would eventually have a contest, and they gave those away. Now, at the time, I was like, oh, that's crazy. I'm never going to win one. I'm not even going to try. But then I've seen a few pop up on eBay and stuff. Very, very, very expensive. But it would be so cool to have one of those. And it was basically a larger proportion of the toy. The bigger cockpit. You imagine the toy from the 80s and the late 70s, but a large version that hung in the aisle. And it had some lights. And I don't think it opened up. I don't think you could do anything inside, but it basically hung in the aisle, looking really, really cool. And again, I can't put enough, reallys how great this thing was. And I wish I tried harder to get it, because there are people who have it. And I guess there's every now and then one pops up on eBay or some other auction place.
Well, like you mentioned, this is not going to be the end of the Falcon. If it shows up in future movies, forget it. The toy market will snatch it up and you'll see more Falcons out there.
And the style of making toys lends itself to being more realistic as each decade goes forward. So eventually kids in the future will have a Millennium Falcon that's almost realistic, just like we've explained it to be, compared to what we had, which was basically like a little area with a fake little hatch underneath to hide a figure and a cockpit.
No, yeah, they get better and better every time. I wish they would also make more of these books, these owner manual books. I know that this particular company put out the Falcon, and then they put out the Death Star, and that's another
one. And they
one.
also put out, for Star Trek fans, the Enterprises, which I have.
And the Klingon Bird of Prey, I believe they did
one
too.
So they're getting a little mileage out of it too.
Well, I would like to thank James for joining me today and going over this. I wish we could do another future one of these again. Now, granted, the Falcon...
There's a lot of ships.
There's a lot of ships, but you know what? Like you said before, the Falcon is like the Enterprise. You can't do a half-hour or even an hour show on a TIE Fighter. You got to have a little little more heart on the ship.
Yeah, our next show might be more like a compendium of ships.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also like to thank our listeners for joining me today. And we will see you here next time on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, bye.
From Kenner's Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back collection, Millennium Falcon that you put together, batteries not included.
Nice landing, Han Solo. Uh-oh, come on, Chewbacca. Stormtroopers are coming.
Action figures each sold separately.
Got him on radar. I'll fire the laser cannon.
There's even a hidden storage hatch.
Ready for takeoff. Jump to light speed. We're gone. On to the Death Star.
Millennium Falcon from Kenner's Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back collection. Action figures each sold separately.
Stop.